This is a long exposure, and when shooting by the ocean, this is how you turn boring water into dynamic photos. It's how I create dramatic seascapes, and for me, there's three big keys when capturing one when using my 14-30, with the first one being how far or close you are to the water.
Now this sounds really basic, but this could change everything from what ND filter you use to what kind of composition you're going to be crafting.
Because let's say we're close to the water like this, where the water is right below our feet, with the main subject being much closer to us. In this scenario, I like to use a shutter speed around half a second to 1 second, and focus on timing the waves coming in.
But why do this over, let's say, a 30-second long exposure?
But with a short exposure, we can create an image that makes it look like the water is moving. And with being so close to the water, we can exaggerate that movement and get it to look like the water is moving towards us. This creates a dynamic foreground element that gives us perspective to how far our background element is,
creating a sort of contrast between our foreground and our background.
This is where having a wide angle can help bring out the movement in the water, since a wide angle will make the edges of the frame feel closer to us and give us more perspective to the water in the foreground.
It also allows us to create more images where we get more into the frame when we're shooting close to the cliffside.
And especially when we put our camera into vertical orientation, we can exaggerate the bottom of the image even more and create a more top to bottom feel to the photo. And when shooting in vertical orientation, you can have your camera much lower to the ground, which will help to bring out the water even more. Just be careful about getting your camera wet.
Bruh.
So when would we use a 30-second exposure?
For me, I like to create those long exposures for when we're much farther away from that body of water. Like when I'm atop a cliffside and the water is much farther from me. In these scenarios, because we're not close, it's hard to make the water feel like it has a ton of movement.
And in these situations, that's when I like to use the long exposure to make the water look still.
This gives us the feeling of a calm landscape and avoids having the water feel jagged and rough. But what's cool about long exposures is that when we have moving clouds in the frame, we can use a much longer exposure, like a 240-second exposure that will showcase the still water, but have moving clouds up top to have a contrast between the water and moving clouds.
It's something that I do a lot when I'm in situations that are overcast, like today.
The only time I'd use a long exposure when I'm close to the water is if the water is very, very still. In that situation, I'm pretty much always using a long exposure because there just isn't much movement to showcase.
Of course, this is how I determine whether to use a long or short exposure, but this is something that you're going to have to use your own judgment on.
But for me, this is how I always determine what kind of exposure I want to use.
And in turn, this will help you decide what kind of ND filter that you want to use. When it comes to picking out your filter, this sounds like something that should be simple on paper, but you could run into some major roadblocks pretty fast.
So we first start by deciding what kind of shutter speed we want, and that's where our first key comes into play. For example, if we want a short exposure, like a 1-second exposure, we'll want a weaker ND filter, like a 3-stop, but we'll need a stronger ND filter, like a 10-stop, if we wanted a long exposure of 30 seconds.
This is because ND filters are measured in stops of light, where 1 stop of light is equivalent from going from 1/100th of a second to 1/150th of a second.
So with a 3-stop ND, we take our 1/250th of a second shutter speed down to 1/50th of a second. And the higher the stops are on our ND filter, the less light that comes into our frame, which means we'll have to drop our shutter speed down as a result. Also, side note, there's this app that I really like to use when calculating shutter speed called PhotoPills.
Not a sponsor, by the way, I just really like the app.
If you go to the exposure settings, it will let you put in your camera settings and the ND filter you're thinking of putting on, and will give you an approximate shutter speed you need to use. It's a nice guide that helps you know what kind of ND filter you need to use, or if you're using a really long shutter speed.
Something else to consider as well is the light that's coming into the frame.
Because when it gets darker, the ND filter's effect will be amplified much more. For example, a 10-stop ND filter in normal lighting could give you around a 30-second long exposure, but when the light goes down, you could be seeing a 240-second exposure.
Which is totally fine if that's the look that you want to go for. But you do have to remember when you're shooting at sunset and sunrise, you are going to be in a bit of a time crunch.
As when taking a 240-second long exposure, you'd have to wait for the camera to finish taking the image before taking another one. and it can be very time consuming. And this also goes the other way, where if it's too bright outside, it can be difficult to grab that 1-second exposure with a 3-stop ND filter.
Because simply put, having too much light coming into the sensor makes it difficult to get the exact shutter speed that we want.
This is why having a 6-stop ND filter is so crucial, because in situations where it's too dark for a 10-stop ND or too bright to use a 3-stop ND, you can use a 6-stop for both short and long exposures, depending on what the lighting looks like outside.
Which leads me to the third and final key, which is to shoot at the right time of day.
Now this rule isn't necessarily applicable to just long exposures, but something that's important to capturing landscapes as a whole.
However, shooting at the right time of day will make capturing long exposures so much easier.
Like I mentioned previously, if you're shooting at the wrong time of day, it makes it impossible to capture the exact long exposure you want, no matter what kind of ND filter you're using. For example, if you wanted to capture a long 30-second exposure to create a sense of stillness throughout your photo, it'd be impossible to do so during the middle of the day, even if you're using a 10-stop ND, since it's just too bright outside. Whereas shooting your landscapes at sunset and sunrise will get you softer light that's much easier to work with when it comes to picking out the ND filter you want to use.
Usually we'll get lighting that's closer to even and give you more flexibility when capturing those long exposures.
And at least in my experience, I do normally prefer the lighting to be slightly too dark than slightly too bright, as when it's darker, sometimes you don't even need to use an ND filter, which isn't a bad thing either.
My general rule of thumb when capturing seascapes is to get there at least an hour and a half before the sun sets or rises. This will give you time to figure out your composition and how you want to capture the photo.
Then, when it's about half an hour before the sun sets or rises, is when you'll start capturing the images, as this is when we'll get that beautiful golden hour sunset that starts to shift towards blue hour. Not only will the colors be incredible, but we'll also get nice soft lighting to create your long exposures. One thing I'd caution you on is to try and not take too long of an exposure, as this will take away crucial time for you to capture more long exposures.
Unless you want to capture that super long exposure. If that's the case, just focus on that.
But to me, that timing is a sweet spot to capturing perfect long exposures.
Before I go behind the camera and capture these long exposures, I want to give you guys a bonus tip.
When out on location and figuring out what kind of long exposure you want to capture, make sure to experiment around with different shutter speeds and see what kind of effect it has on the water. Because even though I mainly talked about the long 30-second exposures and the 1-second exposures, there have been times where I captured 6-second exposures and came out with a beautiful image. Since how fast or slow the water is moving can affect how the images come out, it's always a good idea to try out different exposures and see how it makes the image look.
To me, this is the fun part about capturing long exposures, as you can come out with some really unique images.
And even experimenting with the height of your camera or different ND filters can help you get different results. However, one thing I'd always recommend is to almost always use a wide-angle lens. There really hasn't been another lens that I felt like did as good of a job as a wide-angle when capturing long exposure seascapes.
But with that being said, let's now go behind the camera and I can show you guys how I capture my long exposures.
We'll start at the top of the beach where I'll be capturing my long exposure. I created a composition where I gave enough room for the sky and water, and with the big body of water under me, and because I was so high up, I had plenty of space to work with. And once I got my composition, I went ahead and set the camera to f8 and ISO to 100. Then, put my camera into manual focus. From there, I put on my ND filter and set my shutter speed to time, and took a 78-second exposure. And that's when I hit the shutter button to capture the image, which looks like this, with the beach in the background and plenty of shrubbery in the foreground, while the water below looks smoothed out. And that's when I picked up my camera to go down to the beach and capture the short exposure. And we'll start by setting up our composition where we're including plenty of space for the water to move into our frame, with the cliffside in the background. And once we get our composition, we'll set our aperture to f8 and ISO to 100. Then we'll go ahead and switch our camera into manual focus and grab focus on our main subject right before putting on our 3-stop ND filter. This will get us our shutter speed of 1/3 of a second, and that's where we can wait for the water to come into the frame and capture our images. I will try capturing a couple of different images to see what the differences are in terms of how the water looks. And I ended up really liking this one because the water covers the rocks on the right hand side to create less dead space throughout the image. And that's how I create my long exposure seascapes. Let me know which photo you like more, the long exposure or the short exposure. I'd love to know what you think down in the comment section below.
And if there's any other landscape tutorials that you want to see me do, please feel free to let me know down in the comment section down below.
Also, I ended up doing an editing vlog for my members. So if you want to see how I edited these images, please check out my membership platform here on YouTube. And all you need to do is hit the join icon below to see all my exclusive content and get early access to my videos.
Anyways, thank you guys so much for experiencing the world with me today. I'll catch you guys in the next one.